it's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. Before we get into the show, I want to know something. Are you a tiny houser, and would you like to share your tiny house story and experiences on the podcast? Or are you a business that has a product or service that aligns with the tiny house movement and would be beneficial for the tiny house community that you'd also like to share on the podcast? If so, I'd love to hear from you, and you can head over to tinyhouseconversations.com, and on there you'll see a section that says share your story. If you fill out your details there, I'll get back to you very soon. Now, here's the intro. Hey, it's Lucy here, bringing you another episode of Tiny House Conversations. And if buying land or knowing someone with a spare piece of land isn't an option for you, where can you park your tiny house? How do you find landowners with space to rent or exchange? And these are some of the most common questions when it comes to long-term tiny house parking. And today I'm speaking with Briony Jenkinson, who is an experienced tiny houser from Central Victoria and the founder of Australia's #1 tiny house land search platform, Park My Tiny House. And in Briony's words, her platform is a simple concept matching people like her with people who own land and have some extra space they want to rent out. And tiny house parking is one of those frequently asked about topics in the tiny house world. And in this conversation, we talk about what Park My Tiny House is and the process to offer or find a parking space as a landowner or tiny houser, the benefits of using the Park My Tiny House platform versus using tiny house Facebook groups. We also talk about educating landowners on the benefits of offering space on the land to long-term tiny houses, the typical rental price ranges and the types of exchanges happening between landowners and tiny houses for a parking space, and lots more. This was such a fun conversation with a bunch of laughs in there, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So, on to the show with Briony. Hey, Briony, welcome to Tiny House Conversations, and thanks so much for being here with me today.
No problem. My pleasure.
Pleasure to have you. And what I'd love to do in the conversation today is, start off by learning about your own tiny house experience and then, move into an area that I feel seems to be one of those most frequently asked about topics, tiny house parking, and what you're doing with Park My Tiny House. How does that sound for you?
Yeah, not a problem.
Beautiful. Well, do you want to let us know, take us back to where your tiny house story started? How did you come across them, and what inspired you to move into a tiny house and live this lifestyle?
I sort of stumbled on tiny houses maybe 5-6 years ago on Facebook groups, as you do. I don't even know how it randomly popped up, but I started seeing pictures, and I think like the rest of the world, I went, oh, they're so cute. And I loved the small space concepts behind it and the minimal footprint and the kind of environmental aspects of it, the, doing good for the planet by having a smaller footprint. That really appealed. But I looked at them as something that was a really cool idea, but not for me, because I'm 6'3", and I instantly assumed I would be too claustrophobic in this teeny weeny little box. And I completely ruled it out for the longest time. And then, as you do after a messy divorce a few years back, I was renting. So I'm now a single mum of 2 kids, a 10-year-old and a 16-year-old. I was renting, and then the affordability side of things was just not great because I was at the beginning stages of launching my own business in a different sort of sphere back then. And, it's like when you've got a startup business, you've got the overheads, and the uncertainty of that income just did not feed into the life that I wanted particularly well. And we moved houses, I think it was 5, maybe 6 times over 18 months, as you do, trying to find places that were progressively cheaper and a better fit. And then, as you do, one landlord wanted to sell, so we had to move on. And then the next one decided they wanted to move in, so we had to move on. And I just got completely jack of it and decided, well, it's kind of now or never. So I sold everything I had, which was still very little. Things like my fridge and my washing machine and all the tiny little bits and pieces in massive garage sales over a very, very short period of time. And I used that whopping $2,000 to buy the oldest, daggiest caravan you have ever seen in your entire life. And then I had a month. I gave myself a month deadline. I decided if I was going to do it, like I'm someone who I need a deadline or things just don't happen. So I gave myself a month. I gave my landlord notice, which was scary as hell. And I gave myself a month and I renovated the inside of this caravan and completely gutted it, re-insulated, got the wiring done, put a new kitchen in, all that fun stuff. And a month later, my kids and I moved into this daggy caravan on a block of land up in Trentham, which got very, very cold that winter. It was a horrendous winter, but I actually walk away from that with really good memories because we were in this sort of 17-foot daggy's het caravan and freezing our butts off, but it was the closest we've ever been as a family. Like, we worked really well on that space. Like, caravans have a really efficient layout most of the time. And it taught me that we could live in a small space really easily, and it was actually sort of that best period of time we'd had in terms of our living arrangements and our lifestyle in the years since the divorce, because we were together. We had conversations late at night that we normally wouldn't, because the rental that I'd been in previously was sort of an average 3-bedroom sort of government subsidised rental unit, which meant there was me down one end of the house, there were kids locked in their rooms at the opposite end of the house, and we really didn't connect. It felt like a very disconnected, just felt like I was living alone and then feeding these pets occasionally, as you do. Just under a year after living in the caravan, we decided it was time to upgrade to something that had heating and, like running water and power and things. And it's only through my family, I'm very, very fortunate that my family were able to help me out, and I bought a very, very cheap secondhand tiny house from a young couple who had self-built it in New South Wales.
I love something that you said there, and I feel like it's a common thing that I've heard from a lot of different people I've been speaking to, is being in a small space brought you together, brought you closer as a family, or, whoever it is that you're living with. And I think that's such a beautiful thing. And then I guess on the other hand of that, it's also a place where you can't really hide. And if things come up between, you and your family, your partner and all of that, it's like having to address those things or to find a way of navigating things in a smaller space. But I love that you mentioned that. And I know that from some of the exchanges that you and I have had online, I know that you're a realist around this tiny house lifestyle as well. And, sometimes the challenging sides are not always spoken about. So I'd love to know from your experience, what do you feel like has been one of the biggest challenges about living in a tiny house or a small space?
Reality is my middle name. I'm not afraid to paint the picture. I think probably one of the downsides is people see the Instagram ideal, right? They want this beautifully styled house that just looks like no one lives there and it's a designer display home. And real life, maybe not. Maybe it's just me, I don't know. But it's so not like that. Like, it's me and 2 kids. Our tiny house is 6 meters by 2.5. So it's small. Like, that's 15 square meters. Things get trashed really quickly. It's messy. And if you don't put one thing away, the whole house looks messy. So, I do very little cleaning. I'm the furthest thing from a domestic goddess, but it can get on top of you really quickly. Like, it just takes 1 or 2 small things out of place for you to actually feel like, oh my God, I've got so much work to do. But on the upside from that, it takes 10 minutes to put things away on the weekend and do a vacuum, and, you've got a brand new house again. Give a little, take a little.
Yeah, for sure. And what about one of the best parts about tiny living for you?
There's so many. Honestly, where do you start? Like, my house is very basic. It was a very, very, very cheap house. It's basic in terms of its amenities and things. But I recently had the chance to house sit for some rather well-off friends who have a beautiful, beautiful home just a few k's up the road from me. They have this landscape garden, big house, beautiful furniture, styled to the nth degree, just stunning. But after the first night, I can't wait to get home. Like lying in bed and looking out at this, I have big picture windows looking out over the bush where we live, and you have that mist and the sunrise through the trees. You get to fall asleep looking at the stars, and it's just that feeling of space and that nature aspect and being in tune with nature and the weather and the seasons. That's everything to me.
I love that. I feel like that's come up a lot as well. A lot of people have said the same thing, just being really connected to the weather, the seasons, nature, and your everyday workings of your life that maybe, didn't really have to think about or be involved in when living in an apartment or in the city or in a bigger house, and just kind of living that more modern lifestyle. So that's great. And I'd love to shift gears here a little bit and dive into a bit more about what you do with Park My Tiny House. I know that finding a parking space for a tiny home can be an area of apprehension and uncertainty for many people interested in this way of living. And your platform, Park My Tiny House, it helps to connect landowners who have spare space with tiny houses or potential tiny houses looking to find land to park their house on. So can you let us know a little bit more about how your platform works, and then what's the process if someone's a landowner with space or if someone's a tiny houser looking for space?
Yeah, for sure. I think, look, how it came about, I run a funny story. I was actually thinking about selling my tiny house and upgrading to a brand new, beautiful big model with 2 lofts and all that a couple of years ago. So I actually did a search on Facebook, as you do, looking for a buy, swap, sell site for tiny houses, and I noticed there was nothing specifically in Australia. So again, as you do, I started one, and I love a poll. Like, I love to ask the people's opinion on things and find out what's really going on. And I did a poll because I love my tiny house life so much. I wish everyone had this opportunity if they truly wanted it. And I wanted to look into what's actually stopping people realistically from going tiny. So I did a poll, and the top response for what was preventing people going tiny right now was finding somewhere to park it. So I kind of took it upon myself to solve the problem in a way that would give more people the opportunity to live tiny, but also sort of open the industry a bit, because without landowners offering to rent land long-term for land, we really don't have a tiny house industry in Australia. We really don't have the opportunity for people to live full-time in their tiny houses. So, I sort of decided that was a problem that needed solving, and, launched Park My Tiny House last year to sort of solve that massive gap in the market, to hopefully encourage more people to not be so afraid, I think, of the land equation, because I think it's been, now that we're actually on the market, it's been a big misconception, I think, that the hardest part of going tiny is actually finding somewhere to park. I still do hear that a lot. I still do hear that all the time. But given the last couple of years and the absolute upsurge in take-up of the tiny house lifestyle, builders now have a 12-month waiting list in some areas, and they're doing double the amount of builds that they used to. So, people are obviously rethinking their lives. So how the process works is, from a looking for land point of view, we work on a paid membership subscription model, which allows us to then do some advocacy work, which I'll talk about in a second. But from a member point of view, you join as a member on a monthly basis or a 6-monthly basis. When we send you out a welcome email when you join, one of the links in there is to an online form, which is an application basically, which tells us all about how you live, what your tiny house looks like, what kind of tiny house you have, whether you need power, water, septic, whether you have kids or pets, do you want a garden, what area you're looking in, all the nitty-gritty questions of exactly tell us what you're looking for. And then from that, we then move into sort of more the advocacy side of things, which is, in particular, I've had some more clarity about this after doing the Tiny Houses Expo in Melbourne recently, was I tend to like putting myself out there in public. I know a lot of people shy away from it, but I love this stuff. I really do. So my mission is sort of put myself out there and advertise and promote in all media avenues possible through community newspapers, TV, radio, podcasts, whatever's available to me, to encourage landowners to actually consider having a tiny house tenant long term, rather than what the majority are currently doing, which is looking at renting a corner of their land for short stay platforms, for things like your Airbnb and hip camps, and putting a tiny house on them for that. Because I think there's been a massive take-up rate in that also in the last couple of years, with tiny houses becoming more popular. I think people are now understanding the investment potential of having one as a short stay platform, which is absolutely true. And there's an influx of plenty of them at the moment, which is great. But I think at the moment, we're just sort of treading that delicate balance between there being sort of a tipping point with too many of those, which is taking away the potential opportunity of a lot of permanent tiny houses to have a spot for their tiny house long term. So my kind of point is to encourage hosts to actually consider long stay tenants rather than just a short stay, which is for the good of the industry and a really great support, I think, for the housing crisis and giving people opportunities that they don't have in the traditional market at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you mentioned the two different types of memberships there, so the 1 month and the 6 month. What are the costs of those memberships?
I've tried to keep it really affordable. It's sort of like a Netflix membership. So a monthly subscription is $14.95 a month at the moment. Yeah. And a 6 month membership is $59.95. I'm actually finding there's a lot of people that are doing the 6 month option because they're just in that final research stage, like they're just about to push the button or sign that contract. But I think they just want that peace of mind of knowing that there is actually land available and that there will be something ready for them when they get that delivery date of their future tiny house. So a lot of people are sort of looking a little bit into the future as well and just researching the market as well as the people. Obviously, there's same amount again who are ready to go now or have been moved on from where they are now, because a lot of rural land, which is the majority of what we deal with, is being sold for development purposes, which is, I mean, it's going to happen. It's sad, but it's going to happen. So there's a lot of people being moved on for that reason and needing to relocate their tiny and find somewhere new. So that's something we try and help with as well.
Yeah. So mostly rural. Do you ever get any smaller suburban listings, or is it mostly people with acreage?
It's a tricky one because I have had potential hosts get in touch and show me photos and exactly where they're located. And there have been a couple that have offered really suburban land, but I also do a bit of a risk analysis on behalf of our members as well. There are some where they've sent me photos and it might be a beautiful block, but there are neighbours like a metre from the fence, and you've sort of heard stories in particular council areas about there being potential problems. So I try and mitigate the risk to our members as well, keeping in mind that hiring a tow truck or whatever to move your tiny house is not cheap. So we want to minimise that as much as possible, and we don't want our members to find the perfect spot of land and then a month later a neighbour puts a complaint in and then they're asked to move on. We want to kind of be a little bit careful with exactly what we do accept so that it works best for everyone. If it looks like it's a property that has a great aspect and that I know our members would go for and that doesn't potentially have the risks maybe in particular neighbourhoods, then absolutely we accept everything. It is mostly rural. Having said that, I will say it's about 90, maybe 95% rural in terms of being, say, more than 20 minutes or half an hour from a large town or city. But there are still one or two little exceptions. The moment there's a beautiful listing up on the coast of New South Wales, right on the beach. And it's a small suburban block. I think it's 450 square metres, but it's in a neighbourhood that's very accepting of that kind of dwelling. So there are some places you can afford to take the risk and some that it's probably not worth it. It's a very fine balance.
Yeah. And there definitely is that council regulation and state regulation aspect of it, which is another story for a whole other podcast that I hope to dive into, maybe with the Australian Tiny House Association in future. But you mentioned there before the risk analysis for your members. So there is the option finding land or finding someone, if you're a landowner that has a tiny house, you can do that on Facebook groups. So I'm wondering, besides doing that risk analysis for your members, what are some of the other benefits of using your platform versus using a Facebook group for tiny houses?
In terms of people offering land, I think the advantage is that if someone's paying for a membership with us, they're kind of a pre-vetted potential tenant, and they're serious. If they're actually willing to sort of put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, then they're genuinely interested in finding somewhere to live. Because I have heard a lot of stories with someone generous offering their land in one of the many, many Facebook groups there now are for that sort of purpose. But on speaking to one or two of them that have now listed their properties with our platform, you do get, I don't like the word tire kickers, but there are plenty of people who say, oh, I really like the idea, but often they're not in a position yet. They maybe don't even have their tiny house yet, or they're not quite ready. So some of those platforms can be a little bit of a time waster for a potential host, which is the advantage of people, I think, listing their property and hosting through us, as well as sort of vetting our members a little bit through the application process. In terms of members, the advantage of having a paid membership is that we actually go on the search for you particularly. So a lot of our hosts will approach us from all over Australia and all sorts of random places. So we do get some amazing listings that way with landowners approaching us. But there's also, through our advocacy work, as I was saying before, and me putting my face out there and talking to everyone who will listen, basically, there's also the potential for us to break into areas that maybe people are not yet able to find land in. So I think rather than, the Facebook groups are still a great idea, and there's still a very valid way of finding land, and a lot of people have success with that, which is great. But to my mind, doing it that way and advertising that you're looking for a spot in a particular area will find you land. But my mission is to encourage more landowners to offer land for a much broader group of people, just on an individual basis. My goal is to reach a much bigger audience so that more people all over will offer their land for members to choose from.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing you say is it is this vetting process where you're able to find tiny houses that are serious. And I guess when you're investing your money into something rather than using something that's free, that's one way of showing, okay, you're ready and you're serious to invest in this. And also that, it's the internet. You don't always know who's on the other side of that. So by you doing all the little steps in between and the research on behalf of the landowner or the tiny houser, that you can kind of find a connection between the two that is trustworthy and reliable and all of those kinds of things. So yeah, I really love that. And I'm also curious, how did you find a parking space for your own tiny home, or do you actually own the land that you're on?
I consider myself one of the lucky ones. Some people call it risky. I call it lucky. #blessed.
Love it.
I actually live on my own land. I have an acre of farming zone land up near the sort of Gordon Bolan area in Victoria. I had given up looking. Once I bought the tiny house, we actually lived in a caravan park locally for 6 months while I was on the hunt for land to buy. I had a little bit of money left over from my settlement, so fortunately I was able to sort of go shopping there, but I couldn't find anything for the longest time. This was, when did I buy it? It was 4 years ago. 4 years ago I bought the block, actually 4 years ago last month. And I kind of gave up the search for the longest time because there's just nothing in my very, very minimal, less than 6-figure budget was all I had. So I gave up, and then I just happened to be walking past a real estate agent and saw a picture in the window of a beautiful bush block. And I did a double take. I'm like, no, there's no way that was less than 80,000. There's just no way. So I stayed and watched these 20 screens flick past and watched the whole presentation again to find this exact block that I thought I'd seen, took a photo, went and viewed it, and it was just perfect. It's on a slope, it's in the bush, there's gum trees everywhere, there's wallabies, there's echidnas. It's very, very wildlife and very natural. But it's farming zone, which means that I have no facilities available. It's completely off-grid, so I don't have town power, water, sewer, stormwater, anything like that. So I'm having to be completely self-sufficient as a result, which I think has actually turned out really, really well. I don't have bills, so I don't have that bill stress of every time my email pings, I'm not worried about what's going to hit my inbox like I used to be. It's taken a lot of that financial anxiety away for sure.
Yeah, it sounds divine what you've found and created there. And that is one of the things about the tiny lifestyle is it does take that financial burden off you, and you're able to create, this more back to basics path with less stress. And you've mentioned a few times in the conversation already about landowners. I'd love to give you an opportunity to get on your soapbox a little bit more here about that, because I know that especially after the Tiny House Expo recently, that's become one of your missions. I want to quote something from your page. You said, educating landowners and encouraging them that opening their properties to long-term tiny house dwellers is good for everyone. The tiny house industry, the movement, the economy, and the government. So why is it beneficial? Yeah, that's pretty well written.
Okay.
Why is it beneficial to offer space on their land for long-term tiny houses? I mean, you did talk a bit about that, but if you want to go deeper into that.
In terms of the circle, look, once I actually sat down and thought about it, I thought it's just not just the host and landowner, it's so much bigger than just those two individuals involved. It means tiny house building companies will go gangbusters because more people will be commissioning to build tiny houses if they know they've got somewhere to put it. The builders burgeoning means that they're going to have new employees, so unemployment can potentially be reduced. There can be many more people involved in the industry building. And then there's this massive flow-on effect, means if there's more people living in tiny houses on whether it's rented land or their own land, then that's reducing the potential burden on the housing industry. I mean, I'm hearing stories from all sorts of people having to find a rental property at the moment. It's absolutely horrendous. Like, people are having to go to 40 or 50 open houses and putting in that many applications to even get a look in at one house. It's so bad. Yet there's the tiny house opportunities going, hello, me over here. It just seems like such an obvious thing. And I don't see maybe tiny houses on wheels as a forever solution, but for the short to medium term, I mean, I would be taking up a rental if I wasn't in a tiny house on my own land right now. And then that would, reduce the opportunity that another mum with kids or someone might have to find secure housing. So by not putting that burden on the system, then, the government's not having to subsidise as many, and they're not having to build as many, housing solutions, and affordable housing, such a buzzword, I know. So to reduce some of the burden on that is, good for the government as well.
Yeah, it really is a knock-on effect, isn't it? And it does fall into all these different areas. You're talking about tiny builders, the housing industry, affordability of housing, the government. Like, it is really something that, and especially I think just one, with everything that's happened in the last couple of years, and then two, even with all that's happened up in the Northern Rivers areas, and then lots of other different things that we're all experiencing. So many more people are turning to this way of living. And if, there was able to be more clarity around regulation, and then therefore finances, and then also insurance. I was talking to someone recently. It's like those are the three of the big things that I guess would help things move forward and help make tiny houses accessible for people longer term, not just like short-term rentals and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, landowners, if you're listening to this episode, get in touch with Briony, Park My Tiny House, because I think it's, if you've got space on your land and, there's not really that much going on there, you could definitely earn some income on the side. You could make relationships with tiny houses and form this community, and get help tending to the land and regenerating the land and all of those types of things too. So I think it's like a really great way to just to make this lifestyle more accessible and to connect people within this lifestyle as well.
Oh, absolutely. So on the financial benefits side of things for hosts and landowners, the properties that we have available range from free in doing some work on the property, maybe some clearing or some fencing or looking after some chooks and animals occasionally, right up to, I think, $250 a week for a beautiful property on the Central Coast, New South Wales, which is in the rainforest and has a trickling creek running through the property, which provides full off-grid solar power, water, septic and everything. So it's a massive spectrum of what's available, but there's plenty of options depending on what your scenario is too.
So yeah, what I've heard a lot from different people, talking to different people on the podcast and just offline as well and online, as you said, it can be. I haven't heard of anyone getting it for free, but that's really cool if that's the case. But exchange for work on the land, maybe even other odd jobs, maybe even financial exchange from somewhere from about $50. I think you said up to $250. Is that right? So
yeah, $250 is the absolute maximum, but that
maximum, yeah. 100 to 150 is maybe average, but as you say, depends on off-grid, on-grid, how much space, what the arrangement is. But it's good to know there's lots of different options, and then maybe even a combination of both, right? Like sometimes there's a bit of a financial exchange as well as several hours a week, working odd jobs or something like that.
Absolutely. And one massive advantage and kind of a niche I'm looking at the moment is talking to hosts that are considering having a tiny house as a short stay option to also consider putting a long-term tiny house on the property as well. There are a lot of hosts that have investment properties, which is just vacant land, and they want to put a beautiful tiny house on there, but finding staff at the moment is really hard too. So as a solution that we've come up with sort of a hybrid model where you can have both a short-term and a long-term tiny house. And maybe that person living in the tiny house long-term is there with more of a caretaker arrangement where they can do the handover cleans and all that sort of thing with the short stay platform in exchange for free rent. So there's definitely a potential synergy with both to, why not have both? To do both and have a really great income and someone looking after the property for you in your absence.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, I love it. It makes me excited actually just talking about all of this because, or as you said before, you said that one of the misconceptions you hear is that it's really hard to find a parking space for your tiny home. And it's just, I think, hearing more about this from you today and what you're doing, I feel like it's going to open up things for tiny houses. It's going to open up opportunities, but even just a shift in mindset of like, well, actually, it's not super hard, and platforms like yours make it a lot easier to find somewhere that can be long-term and somewhere that you can have someone connect with someone that's trusted. And yeah, I love what you're doing. And I think it's such a amazing offering to the community and to the tiny house community and beyond. I would love to know, so with your own tiny house journey, is there anything that you would do differently or that you wish you knew before you started on this journey?
I live in the school of no regrets. I love my life. I love everything about it. I don't think there's anything I wish I'd known or I would have done differently. But if I had my time again, I would probably have prioritized, rather than going away on holidays and building the deck, which is still amazing, I probably would have prioritized putting in a solar system twice the size, if not more, that I currently have, because my current one is rather inadequate and my generator does cop a beating.
I feel like, is that one of those things that you kind of, as you moved in, you kind of learned like all these different things that you needed to make it work, or like different things going wrong and then having to adapt and deal with them as you went?
Probably the former, because I have listened to a lot of your other interviews, and the kind of overall vibe that I'm getting is people tending to buy or build a tiny house and, invest the 10, 15,000 in solar and everything. I've come from the other side of things, which is completely bootstrapping the whole experience. A really affordable tiny house, a really affordable block of land, because that's from necessity, and the most basic solar. I think I spent a couple of grand. My dad's helped me, I want to say, cobble together a system that will do short term, but I've killed like 3 generators. Already I'm on my 4th one from overuse because the system that I've got's really not adequate. No one tells you this stuff. this is real life, is sometimes when you're bootstrapping it, you sort of hobble along and it just makes do for the time being. But the goal is to absolutely upgrade that to a point where I don't need to be thinking what time of day it is and whether I need to start the generator to charge the batteries some more, and just be able to plug things in and like a regular house, that's quite a luxury when I go away, and I always stay in hotels because day-to-day life is a little bit like camping, which is awesome. But going away and being able to flick a switch and boil the kettle without thinking about it, oh my gosh, like you have no idea the novelty of that unless you've been living that lifestyle for a while.
Oh, I love it. I know what you mean. So I'm yet to move into my tiny house. It'll be later this year, but I know that when I've gone away, I lived in Africa a long time ago for 6 months. And I remember like living basically with no running water. And there was a generator, I think, for like an hour in the middle of the day. And then in the evening, we had candles and all that kind of stuff. And I just remember it made me appreciate those comforts and things that we have in our everyday lives when going back home, just like even just getting into your bed with like a pillow, and so I totally feel you. And you mentioned earlier as well, so you live in your tiny home and you've got kids as well. So how many kids have you got, and what are their ages, and how is that working out for them?
Initially it was not ideal. My little boy is 10 and my daughter is 16. So initially when we moved in, because my house is 6 meters long, there's a queen bed, which is like a platform bed because I do not do lofts. I'm 6'3". It's just not going to work for me. Plus my 10-year-old sleeps like an octopus. He's all over. He's ridiculous. He'd fall out of a loft, let's be honest. So we co-sleep in the queen bed, and my daughter, who was sort of 14 at the time we started all this, I think, was sleeping on the couch, which if you've seen any tiny house designs, they're usually a modular couch with a very thin cushion. She's super skinny, so she said it didn't worry her and that was fine, but she's obviously needed her privacy. So we sort of accidentally started developing a mini village on our block, and my daughter now has her own 3.6 metre long tiny house, which is just a bed and a desk, and kind of like what people were doing 20 years ago, letting the teenagers live in a caravan, but probably a little bit more extra upmarket version of that in a mini designer eco tiny house. So she's happy now that she's got her own space and she has that quiet time, because my son and I tend to talk nonstop and that really gets to her. So now it's working well, but that's been a long-term progression as well.
Yeah, getting used to, right. And as we start to close out the conversation, Briony, is there anything else you feel like we haven't covered when it comes to landowners, parking space for tiny houses, or anything that you're doing with Park My Tiny House?
Possibly. After chatting to a lot of people at the expo recently, it was really interesting, the proportion of people that I spoke to who wanted to get a membership and are looking for land, but are actually looking for land in communities, because people like myself and a lot of my other colleagues in the industry that I know, definitely people that are introverts and need their own space and couldn't think of anything worse than living in a community with close neighbours. But by the same token, I think as a result of the last couple of years, there's more people looking for community and that sense of kinship, and to have people around you as a bit of a safety net, I think, and to be able to share resources, and sort of going back to the model that we were doing maybe 50 or 100 years ago in, it takes a village kind of ethos. So there's a lot of people looking for that. So as a result, I'm actually going to be adding in coming weeks a new portal within the Park My Tiny House platform, especially to connect those offering and seeking a space in a community, so that there's a platform where everyone together can be posting and sharing what they're looking for and where they're offering, rather than having, at the moment there's dribs and drabs all over the net, all over 100 different Facebook groups. So I think it would be great to have that one-stop shop of just one place where people can offer and seek land in certain areas, and have a portal for everyone to connect in a community kind of environment.
Oh, that sounds great. And I love that you mentioned community, because I actually have another quote of yours that I'd love to read right now, because I feel like it speaks to that. You said, being a tiny houser feels like a bit like being in a secret club. You feel as though you're part of something truly special. There's a camaraderie amongst the community purely through the knowledge that we share a similar lifestyle. It's clear many people want into this club. We all want to feel connected, embraced, and understood. And that is something that I feel like it just really sums things up really beautifully, even whether it's the tiny house community or whether it's just being human.
I think that was, very evident from the expo and the conversations that we had, is that people really are looking for that,
Beautiful. And do you want to let everyone know a little bit more? So you alluded to at the beginning of our conversation, you created your own Facebook group for Buy, Swap and Sell. So do you want to let everyone know what the name of that group is and just maybe a little bit more about it?
Yeah, the funny thing, I planned to upgrade, and then once I actually had a serious offer for my tiny house through that platform, I decided I couldn't bear to part with it. So I've kept it for 4 years now and cancelled the upgrade and bought Amber her little house instead. So the reason I developed the Buy Swap Sell group was to sell my house, but I ended up keeping it, and now hundreds of other people are selling their houses. So funny the way things work out, doesn't it?
Yes, it is.
The Facebook handle is, I believe it's at Tiny Houses Buy and Sell Australia.
I will put everything in the show notes, and also just want to let everyone know where they can connect with you online, whether it's your website for Park My Tiny House and your social media platforms as well.
Yeah, I've tried to keep it really simple. So the website's just Park My Tiny House with no spaces.com.au, and the Facebook and Instagram are both the same, at parkmytinyhouse.com.au. Beautiful.
So if you want to access the show notes, you can find those at tinyhouseconversations.com. And Briony, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your stories and experiences with us, and for sharing all about what you're doing with Park My Tiny House. As I said, I think it's a really wonderful offering to the tiny house community and beyond, and I can't wait to see what unfolds for you in this space. So thank you again for sharing.
You're welcome. Always happy to talk about anything tiny house related. I get a bit excited.
I know. Me too. So if you're listening to this episode, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us today. If you want more tiny house conversations, make sure you stay tuned every Thursday, because that's when I release new episodes. And until the next one, I'll see you then. Hey, tiny houses, thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.